Welcome back, everyone, to another divisional preview as we are only 6 days away from regular season puck drop. And today we're going to be covering the other division in the Eastern Conference, the Metropolitan Division. But before we dive into this, there is some news regarding the Atlantic Division, which we already covered. So I do need to start off with some unfortunate news. And the day after I released my Atlantic Division preview episode last week, it was announced that Alexander Barkov of the Florida Panthers suffered a terrible injury in practice. It looked like a harmless injury, a no-contact injury, but he went down holding his knee, and then it turns out that he tore his ACL and will require surgery. I might have even heard that it was ACL and MCL. Regardless, reports are saying that he's going to be out for 7 to 9 months. So that is a huge loss for the Florida Panthers, two-time defending Stanley Cup champions, and honestly, going into the season, probably still the favorite had Barkov still been healthy and in the lineup. It's terrible to see how this happened. Like I said, it's an innocent play, just a complete freak accident that's going to have him sidelined for pretty much the entire season. Barkov is one of those guys. Not only is he a hell of a player to watch, one of the best two-way guys. He won the Selke last year. He's the leader of the best team in the NHL right now. So it's terrible to see this go down, and hockey aside, Barkov is apparently just like the best guy. You could tell he's just a guy that everybody wants to root for, just a class act, and no matter how tired you are of the Florida Panthers, nobody wants to see a guy like Barkov miss an entire season. So massive loss for the Florida Panthers, who will already be short Matthew Tkachuk. We mentioned that in our last episode. He's going to miss at least the first half of the season, might not even be ready for the Olympics. And speaking of the Olympics, we're talking about a huge loss for the Florida Panthers. Also a massive loss for Team Finland. He's their number one center, also one of their best players. Just a really shitty situation. It would have been his first time representing Finland at the Olympics, but that's definitely not going to happen this year. So very unfortunate to see that happen, but that's the way she goes in professional sports. I do hope that he could somehow make it back for playoffs. Like I said, the timeline is 7 to 9 months. If he can miraculously, recover in 7 months and be NHL ready, would be great to see him and Matthew Tkachuk both back in the lineup. Not that I want the Florida Panthers to three-peat, but I definitely want whoever wins, whoever takes them down in the end, to do it without any asterisks. They're a dynasty. They're one of the best dynasties we've seen in recent memory. So a shitty way for that to end is, by injury and not by a team actually outplaying them on the ice. I'm talking like it's already done. Who knows what's going to happen? Fingers crossed for Barkov. Hopefully he makes a full recovery in time for the playoffs. A couple more things I do need to talk about before we talk about the Metropolitan Division. There were a few huge signings in the last week, a couple of which are from the Atlantic Division. I might as well run through them all just because, it's huge news, but I'll talk more about the Atlantic Division ones because the rest we're going to cover in our divisional previews. So first, September 27th, whenever that was, 5 days ago, Mason McTavish finally ended his holdout with the Anaheim Ducks as he agreed to a 6-year, $7 million contract. A lot of people thought maybe they weren't going to come to an agreement and eventually Pat Verbeek was going to shop him around, but I don't think that was going to happen. This isn't a guy you want to trade early on in his career, and I've been very high on Mason McTavish in past episodes. Anyone who's listened to Puck Drop from day one knows how much I like this guy, so it all makes sense, and it's a great contract for both sides, honestly. He's got term, he's got a decent paycheck, and they have an amazing young core to look forward to in Anaheim. Cam Fowler of the St. Louis Blues also extended 3 years, $6.1 million a year. Good extension for them. Anthony Stolarz of the Toronto Maple Leafs. We were talking about him last week covering the Atlantic. He re-signed a 4-year deal with a cap hit of $3.75 a year. That is amazing. That's a really, really good deal for this goaltender. He's only 31 years old, and last year I think he was 5th in save percentage in the league. He kind of, it was his first time as a starter last year. I mean, that said, Wool did start more games than him, but I think Stolarz was the better goalie, and it showed because he was their playoff goalie in that first round against the Ottawa Senators. An amazing signing by Brad Treliving, who now has his his 1A, 1B tandem for the next 3 years for less than $8 million. and they're both great goalies, Wool and Solar. So well done, Tree Living. Just a couple of days later, Kirill Kaprizov finally agreed to an extension. Now, there were reports earlier in the summer that he rejected an 8-year deal worth $6 million a year, which would have made him the highest paid player in NHL history. After that happened, speculation went crazy. Everyone's thought, oh, he's leaving Minnesota. He wants to be traded. He doesn't want to stay there. Well, of course not. He was just negotiating because that's his right, and he had a lot of time. Of course, he wasn't, or he was under contract this year. And Bill Guerin told him that he would make him the highest paid player in the NHL. I don't know if that's the best negotiation tactic by Guerin, but anyway, they finally did agree to an 8 times $17 million contract, $136 million in total, a massive deal when it comes to NHL standards. I did see a graphic comparing him to the highest paid player in the other major four sports, and it wasn't even close. It's crazy how underpaid NHL players are, or how overpaid the other three sports are. Either way, Kaprizov with a $17 million cap hit for the next 8 years. Currently, the highest cap hit in the NHL is Austin Matthews at 13.25. So Kirill Kaprizov absolutely smashed that number. That said, there's still a lot of guys that will need contracts soon, including Connor McDavid, who, I don't know if he's going to ask for that much, especially if he stays in Edmonton, because it's going to be hard for that team to build a winner around that cap hit. I'm talking about Minnesota with 17 million. A lot of people know that no NHL team has won the cup paying a player more than 10 million a year. So it's going to take some work for Guerin to build a cup-winning team around the $17 million cap hit by Kirill Kaprizov. Let's move on. Like I said, we'll talk about him more in detail next week when we cover the Central Division. Luke Hughes, he re-signed with the New Jersey Devils, another player who had no contract and might have held out and missed some time. Thankfully, that didn't happen. He signed a 7-year deal worth $9 million AAV. We're going to talk about the Devils today, so we can move right on to Nico Mikkola of the Florida Panthers. We covered the Atlantic Division last week. I mentioned how important this guy was, along with the other 5 D-men on that team. He signed for an 8-year deal worth $5 million a year. Great contract for both sides, honestly. He is a third-pairing guy, although he could be a second-pairing guy on a lot of teams. But he's locked up until he's 36 or 37 years old. So he's likely finishing his career in Florida, making a decent chunk of change, but not breaking the bank. Great deal for both sides. And then back to Anaheim. Pat Verbeek was not finished after re-signing Mason McTavish. He also extended Jackson Lacombe to an 8-year deal worth $9 million a year. Kind of surprising to me, to be honest. He is a couple years older than McTavish, but he only has 2 full NHL seasons under his belt, whereas McTavish has 3. So you could argue he's a less experienced player who just got a much bigger contract. They're both great players. Jackson Lacombe proved this year that he is a stud on the blue line, a good puck-moving guy who's only 24 years old, obviously going to get better. He, along with Olin Zellweger and Pavel Mintyukov, are the future of this team's blue line. Not a bad future to have. But I am still shocked by the big number for, a somewhat unproven player. All right, that's it for the signings from the past week. There were a bunch of players placed on waivers this past week, which is obviously normal at this time of year, but we're not going to go over that. Nobody of real significance, and I really got to try to cut these episodes. I know I say this every time, and once I get talking, I ramble for quite some time, but we're going to stick to the important stuff. Let's get into it. The Metro Division preview. Starting from the bottom, we have an easy pick here, and they're pretty much the only team that openly admitted that they are rebuilding, and that is the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins had a tough season last year. After being one of the most dominant teams in the 2010s, they are now entering their first rebuild since winning that very lucky lottery and drafting Sidney Crosby back in 2005. Crosby hadn't missed a single playoff in his entire career until the 2022-2023 season, and then that trend continued as they've missed the playoffs last year for the 3rd straight year. Although they tried to fight this downward spiral by bringing in guys like Erik Karlsson a few years ago, it unfortunately didn't help enough, and last offseason, it seemed like they had already accepted their fate as they didn't do much to improve their already subpar team. So the Penguins' struggles last year weren't a huge surprise for anyone. Despite Crosby still being an elite centerman and setting an NHL record with 20 consecutive point-per-game seasons, it just wasn't nearly enough for this team to bounce back. The Penguins finished last year with a record of 34, 36, and 12, which was good for 80 points and 7th in their division, ahead of only the Philadelphia Flyers, their state rivals. Now, this led to the firing of their head coach, Mike Sullivan, who was the second longest tenured coach in the league. He led the Penguins to those back-to-back cups back in 2016 and 2017. And so his firing was the last nail on the coffin. A lack of significant moves in the offseason and openly embracing this rebuild, it's very easy for me to place them as the bottom feeder here in the Metro Division and probably the worst team in the Eastern Conference. So, what did they actually do in the offseason? Well, they lost Matt Grzelcyk, Alex Nedeljkovic, Pierre Olivier Joseph, excuse me, Matt Nieto, Emil Benstrom, and of course head coach Mike Sullivan, who they replaced with head coach Dan Muse. They also brought in Arturs Shilovs from Vancouver Canucks, Anthony Mantha, a guy who I always thought would be better than he is, and I think that every single year. I'm pretty much done thinking that. But anyway, he's there for some depth. Connor Clifton on the blue line, Justin Brazeau, Matthew Dumba, Parker Witherspoon, Raphael Harvey Pinard, and recently Robbie Fabry on a PTO. So it sounds like they did a lot of names, but none that are really going to help improve this roster. And that was obviously on purpose. They didn't overcommit to anyone. They only signed 1-year deals. Everybody I just named was signed to a 1-year deal except for Parker Witherspoon, who was signed to a very low-cost 2-year deal. So that lines up perfectly with their rebuild. They already have a ton of draft picks in the coming seasons, and they're probably going to be looking to sell their high-end players throughout the season at the deadline. So while things aren't looking good in the next coming years, they have pieces that can make their future bright. Looking at their team last year, they were actually pretty decent offensively. They had the 6th best power play in the league. Now, obviously that's going to happen when you have guys like Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and Carlson on your power play, but all those guys are on the wrong side of 30, so I'd pretty much guarantee that those power play numbers are going to regress, even without factoring in the fact that a lot of these guys are going to be traded, like I said. The other side of the ice didn't fare too well for the Penguins last year. Makes sense. They had decent offensive numbers, but they finished near the bottom of the league, so obviously you can conclude that their defense and or goaltending was a big problem. They have Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang, both on the right side of the ice, eating tons of minutes, future Hall of Famers that are great pieces to have. But Ryan Graves was supposed to be a solid top unit pairing on the left side, but he had a horrible year last year. Definitely wasn't the Ryan Graves that I remember seeing in Colorado or New Jersey. And then this summer they went out and acquired Matt Dumba, who I just mentioned. He's had his own issues. Kind of explains why he's on his 4th team in 3 years. Ryan Shea, a borderline AHLer. Parker Witherspoon, another fringe NHLer. So these are the names that make up their 6 defense. And I wouldn't expect things to look very different than last year in terms of their defensive numbers. But instead of looking at what they will do on the ice, let's focus on what their plan should be. Like I said, they're obviously a rebuilding team. So what can this organization do to improve down the road? If they really want to, they can move a lot of their big names for a big chunk of change throughout the season. If these players want to leave, all 4 of those future Hall of Famers that I mentioned, they all have no move clauses. So it's really up to them if they'll want to leave Pittsburgh. That said, if Dubas starts to take apart the team around them, I wonder what would really make them stay, especially a guy like Erik Karlsson, who doesn't have a whole career of loyalty to Pittsburgh. I'm sure he wouldn't mind getting moved for one last crack at the big trophy. There's even rumblings of him going back to where it all started in Ottawa, so that'd be pretty cool. We've heard trade rumors for both Sid and Malkin all summer long, but like I said, these guys control their fate. They can choose whether they want to stay or leave, and they can choose where they would be moved to. They have all the control, and they've earned that right by bringing this franchise 3 Stanley Cups. I'm not going to speculate much further because there's a lot of teams to cover, and like I said, this speculation has gone on all summer. But I will say this, and I think I speak for all hockey fans, I think it would be awesome to see Sidney Crosby back in the playoffs again. So let's leave it at that. Fingers crossed. The Penguins are rebuilding. There's not going to be much noise on the ice. Hopefully for them, lots of action off the ice, lots of 1-year deals, like I mentioned, that they signed, which are great rentals to move at the deadline. So we'll see what Kyle Dubas does for this team, but we can move on. The over-under for the Pittsburgh Penguins is set at 76.5, and that's an easy under for me. I think they did not get better than last year. If anything, they got worse. So smashing the under. Next up in the Metro, we have the New York Islanders, finishing 7th in the division. Whether they want to admit it or not, they themselves are somewhat slipping into a rebuild as well. They may not be openly saying it to the public like Pittsburgh, but it isn't a huge secret as they traded away their number one D-man for a couple of first-round draft picks in this past draft. They had a great run earlier on in the decade, a couple of deep playoff appearances, but they've been slowly declining ever since. They were knocked out of the first round of the playoffs in 2024, and then they didn't really change much to their veteran lineup last year. They removed a retired Clutterbuck, and then they added a young Anthony Duclair. But that wasn't nearly enough to keep them relevant. They were one of the oldest teams last year, and then, of course, it doesn't help that they had some very bad injuries to guys like Matt Barzell, Romanov, Pelech, Mayfield. But, I mean, in the end, it was just a very tough year, a struggle for this team. They finished with a record of 35, 35, and 12. Honestly, not horrible considering their man games lost. But that record, along with the negative 36 goal differential, will not have you coming close to a playoff spot. So this offseason, they did get a bit younger. And they did add some new names to their lineup. Looking at them on paper right now, you could easily argue that my placement here at 7th in the division is crazy, but I'm rolling with it. I know at least one Islanders fan who's going to give me shit for this, but we're sticking to it. So, the departures this summer for the Islanders. I mentioned they traded Noah Dobson. Matt Martin also joined his longtime line mate Cal Clutterbuck in retirement, so we wish him a happy retirement. D-men Mike Riley, Scott Peronovich, and Grant Hutton all gone. But the additions for this team are definitely names that will be more familiar to the average hockey fan. Jonathan Drouin, they signed him to a 2-year deal worth $4 million a year. David Rittich, the goaltender, to back up Ilya Sorokin. Emil Heineman was a piece of that Noah Dobson trade. Maxim Shabanov and Matthew Highmore. These are the new faces in town. But the best part of the Islanders offseason was the draft. Not only did they move Dobson to get the 15th and 16th pick and select two guys who many experts thought would have been drafted higher in Victor Ekelund and Kayshawn Aitchison, who got absolutely rocked by Noah Juleson in a preseason game a few days back. I wasn't sure he was going to get up, but he did because he's a hockey player. But the cherry on top of these two great picks was winning the lottery and selecting D-man Matthew Schaefer first overall, who looks like an absolute gem. Now, I know it's only preseason, but he's showing he's very much NHL ready. And it's very rare to see a D-man jump right into the NHL in his draft year. But I hope and I think Schaefer can do it this year. I know he had a tough injury last year in juniors, but like I said, he's playing amazing in preseason, not just one game. I've seen him in a few different games, and he looks incredible. A friend of mine actually asked me who was the last D-man to play in that same year he was drafted, and I believe it was Rasmus Dahlin back in 2018. So it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but I hope we see Schaefer doing that this year. Let's actually break down that trade real quick. The Islanders sent their top D-man Noah Dobson to the Habs. Dobson was coming off a down year. He put up 70 points the year before, but we talked about how many injuries the Islanders had last year. That obviously contributed to Dobson's point drop-off, especially on the power play, as the Islanders put up an embarrassing 12.6% last year. Second worst in the league, only above the Anaheim Ducks. Their 5-on-5 scoring wasn't much better. So moving Dobson is surely going to hurt their offense and power play numbers, but at least they brought in Tony DeAngelo last winter. I believe they signed him in January, and he's obviously going to be a big piece who could possibly quarterback that top unit on the power play to a reasonable level. That is, if Matthew Schaefer doesn't claim the role himself. But the part of the trade that is overlooked to me is Emil Heineman coming back the other way, along with those two first-round picks that I mentioned. But I think Emil Heineman is a great player in that bottom six role. A lot of people don't know about him, but he's got a hell of a shot, and he is a workhorse. He throws the body around a lot more than you'd expect. And with the Islanders dismantling the longest tenured fourth line seemingly ever, since both Cal Clutterbuck and Matt Martin have retired, I think Heineman is going to be a great guy to fill those shoes alongside Casey Cizikas, who's going to miss his longtime partners. But like I said, Heineman's a great piece that not a lot of people know about. He was a rookie last year, but he's got a lot of intangibles, a lot of good tools that will help him be a great fit on this fourth line. Now, when we look at free agent signings, the best addition for this team is likely going to be Jonathan Drouin, although he is a huge wild card, and he has been since he was a highly touted prospect who was drafted third overall by the Tampa Bay Lightning back in 2012, I want to say. Nope, 2013. Very close. He had a bounce back year last year after being reunited with Nate McKinnon in Colorado, but still, he isn't nearly the player that a lot of people thought he would be. But this is his chance for a third hit at that reset button. So we'll have to wait and see how he's going to fare in Long Island. Patrick Roy has a lot to play around with that top six. Two great players down the middle in Bo Horvat and Matt Barzal. You can even extend that further. I think JG Pajot is a solid third line center. So we'll see who Drouin ends up playing with. He excels as a puck carrier and a passer, so I'd like to see him. I think he'd fit in well with Bo Horvat and maybe Anders Lee, two guys who can really put the puck in the net, though he and Anders Lee both kind of play on the left side. I mean, Drouin and Lee. Anyway, we'll see what Patrick Roy does with his lineup. Like I said, on paper, they're not too bad, but it all depends on how they're going to age and how well they can stay healthy. Matt Barzal has had some health troubles lately, which is tough because he is their leader, their best player. We mentioned a big hole on defense with Dobson gone, but they still have a steady back end with Tony DeAngelo, Alex Romanov, Pullock, and Pellick, two guys who are always interchangeable for anyone who isn't a big Islanders fan, and then Scott Mayfield and hopefully Matthew Schaefer. Honestly, this isn't what a team that just drafted first overall should look like, which would make it even more impressive if Matthew Schaefer could earn the spot on opening night. And then they also have Boquist and Isaiah George, who can be competing for that last roster spot on defense. And then finally, in nets, we have Ilya Sorokin, who at times can be the best goalie on the planet or can just sit back into mediocrity. That said, of all the teams that I'm placing near the bottom of the list, I think the Islanders would be my pick to shock the hockey world and shock myself and somehow squeeze into the playoffs. And that is mostly because of Ilya Sorokin. We've seen him will his team into the playoffs back in 23 and 24. But the big question is going to be the health of Matt Barzal, who is without a doubt their most talented offensive player. If these two guys can be at the top of their game, the Islanders can be a tough team to play against. However, if things don't start off well, I think they're not too far from a full-on rebuild, something that Lou Lamoriello would never allow under his reign. But now with Matthew Darche in charge, I definitely think it is a possibility. The Islanders over-under is at 84.5, and that's a tough one, but I'm going to go with the under for them as well because of the tough competition in the East and the big question marks that this team has to overcome. Next up at 6 in the Metropolitan Division, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. We talked about the Penguins and the Islanders being on the older side. Well, the Flyers are the fourth youngest team going into this season. And while that showed last year with plenty of growing pains, it also shows some of the elite skill that they're going to have in years to come. They finished last year with a record of 33, 39, and 10, last place in the Metro, and yet again out of the playoffs. It wasn't at all a surprise that the Flyers would drop off from the previous season, as they shocked everyone by being in the playoff mix until the very last game of the season. But now, officially in the rebuild, Briere was able to draft both Matvei Michkov last year and then Porter Martone this year at 6th overall. Briere also made big moves to help them out down the middle, signing Christian Dvorak and then trading for young, skilled Trevor Zegras, who is already gelling well with Michkov, and he's looking like he's going to be that guy playing at that 1C role to start the season. And in addition to these two centermen, the Philadelphia Flyers also acquired Dennis Gilbert and Noah Juleson on D, as well as Dan Vladar in nets. Dan Vladar is going to be a huge player for this team. Whether good or bad, he can very much dictate how the season's going to go for the Flyers. They never really recovered between the pipes following the whole scandal that led Carter Hart to leave the NHL. Samuel Urson did all he could for this team, but he was never really well suited to be the team's starter. And while Dan Vladar has never really been given the reins as a starter himself, this is his chance to prove himself. Now, thankfully for the Flyers, they didn't really lose much in the offseason. The guys that I just mentioned that they got will clearly outweigh the losses. Ryan Pilling went to Anaheim, Jacob Pelletier went to Tampa, Ivan Fedotov, their goaltender, their backup goaltender, went to Columbus, and then Lixill went to Ottawa. I have no idea how to actually pronounce his name. This team is going to be quite fun to watch, I think. They have real flashy skill in that top six. Matvei Michkov, Trevor Zegras, Travis Konechny, Owen Tippett, Couturier, Forrester. A lot of these guys really embody what being a Flyer should be. They got grit mixed with speed and skill, and they can use Zegras for more offensive roles while focusing Couturier on the defensive side of the game, as well as Christian Dvorak, who I mentioned they got down the middle. Those are two great defensive centermen who can hopefully make up for Trevor Zegras' lack of responsibility in the defensive zone. On defense, this Flyers team really didn't change much, aside from bringing in former first-round pick Noah Juleson. Don't get it twisted, though. He's not playing like a first-round pick. He's bounced around to a few different teams. But the Flyers' defensive numbers were pretty good last year, considering the spot in the standings where they ended up. But that was always a focus of John Tortorella's coaching style, and that was most apparent with a guy like Travis Sanheim, who really evolved into an elite defender under Torts. They led the league in block shots and gave up the fifth fewest expected goals at 5-on-5. So, curious to see how different the team's defense is going to look under Rick Tocchet, their new head coach. The main guy for me to watch, aside from Jamie Drysdale, who still really hasn't tapped all of his potential, but Cam York, a guy that was drafted 14th overall back in 2019. I get a feeling that he didn't really gel well with John Tortorella as a coach. And while he put up decent offensive numbers and even saw some power play time 2 years ago, he was completely left off the power play last year and ultimately saw his numbers go down. He's got tools to be a solid two-way guy, but he just hasn't become the player that the Flyers need him to be. So I'm sure Rick Tocchet is going to spend some extra time on him to try to help him find his game because he can be a very key player for this team down the road. Now, I mentioned Sean Couturier and Christian Dvorak playing a defensive role down the middle, but I left out Noah Cates, who's also a solid defensive player, and he's surely going to help improve their bad penalty kill numbers from last year. Now, I mentioned this for the Islanders, but same thing goes for the Flyers. If this season starts off poorly, I'm very curious to see what Briere would look to do in terms of approaching the sell season. Like I mentioned last episode, the trade deadline is not going to be as exciting as it has been in past years. So instead of saying what he's going to do at the deadline, I'm kind of calling it the sell season because, like I said, I think teams are going to be more inclined to sell earlier rather than wait until March. Assuming they want to hold on to their pending RFAs in Trevor Zegras, Jamie Drysdale, Bobby Brink, Igor Zamula, that doesn't really leave them many low-term players that they can trade as a rental at the deadline. Nick Seeler is a guy who's got a great contract in my opinion, so I think they could use him and get a decent return from him if they decide to trade him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's see how the season starts out for this Flyers team. While I still have them on the outside of the playoffs, I think they're going to be a fun team to watch with a lot of flash and pizzazz. The keys for this team is continued growth from Matvei Michkov along with Trevor Zegras, Drysdale finding his game. We saw both these guys, Zegras and Drysdale, play really well early on in their careers in Anaheim, especially Zegras in that sophomore season. So we know he has it in him. It's just what's it going to take for him to get back to what he was before. The over-under on the Philadelphia Flyers is set at 83.5, and I think I have another under here. Now, I will say I think one of my guesses is going to be wrong. Between the Flyers and the Islanders, one of them is going to hit the over. Knowing my betting skills, it only makes sense. Next up, fifth in the Metro Division, and a team that will be battling for a wild card spot, but ultimately, in my opinion, they're going to miss out on the playoffs yet again, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets. The team that nearly every hockey fan in the world was rooting for last year in the wake of the Johnny Gaudreau tragedy. The Blue Jackets went in with no expectations and came out looking like a fringe playoff team. Similar to the other young teams in the East, the Blue Jackets surpassed expectations and really impressed the hockey world. They had a breakout season from a number of young players, but none more impressive than the Norris caliber season from Zach Werenski. Now, we've known for a while how good this guy can be, but he took it to another level last year. And then second to him in terms of impressive seasons would have to be Kirill Marchenko, who went from a 42-point career high to 74 points and 31 goals last year, tied for the team lead in goals with 20-year-old Adam Fantilli. Now, it might seem like they lost more players than they added over the offseason, but they had quite a logjam in their bottom six, but they brought in a guy who could very well be their 2C, even though that slot is likely filled. So they can happily play with a 3 deep center position. So let's take a look at who left town over the summer and who the Blue Jackets brought in. Goaltender Daniil Tarasov went to Florida. James Van Riemsdyk signed in Detroit. Jack Johnson recently signed a PTO in Minnesota. Sean Corrali went to Boston. Justin Danforth, Buffalo. Lou Kunin to Florida. And then Kevin LeBanc, who is still a UFA. Definitely some names that are important depth pieces, but like I mentioned, they had an abundance of those, so they had to move on. Now, before we get into free agency, which started on July 1st, the Blue Jackets re signed defenseman Dante Fabro and Ivan Provorov. Fabro, they actually claimed off waivers back in November from the Nashville Predators, and he had a strong season, so much so that he earned himself a 4-year deal worth just over $4 million annually. You love to see those little redemption stories. And then Ivan Provorov also extended the day before he reached free agency. They signed him to a 7-year deal with an AAV of 8.5 mil, a pretty big cap hit for a player who just hasn't been nearly as good as he once was back in Philadelphia. I guess they're just banking on his contract becoming, middle tier when the cap goes up. But honestly, we talked about the Florida Panthers signing Ekblad for 6.1. I would definitely take that contract over Provorov's any day. I'd probably even take Nico Mikola's contract over Provorov. I don't think this guy is an 8.5 million D. At least he has not shown that in recent years. So I think this signing is honestly going to be a bit of a crutch for this team, but we'll see what happens. They also re-signed guys like Owen Sillinger, Dmitry Voronkov, who had a similar AAV as Fabro, just over 4 mil for 2 years. But the new faces in town that Columbus brought in over the offseason are from their trade with the Colorado Avalanche back in June. The Blue Jackets sent Gavin Brindley, a third-round pick, and a conditional second-round pick to Colorado for Miles Wood and Charlie Coyle. A solid trade for the Blue Jackets. They gave up 2 picks that definitely have some value, but they got 2 veteran players, one of which, in Charlie Coyle, who can definitely slot into a 2C role. However, with a fully healthy team, they would be happy to have him on the third line behind Sean Monahan and Adam Fantilli. Last year, the Blue Jackets were one of the better offensive teams in the league. They were 7th in goals per game, but their shooting percentage was just over 10%, which I think is going to be pretty hard to replicate this year. Their power play, on the other hand, was at the bottom half of the league. They finished at 19.5%, good for 22nd in the NHL. Let's take a look at Kirill Marchenko real quick. A guy that, as I mentioned, had a breakout season last year. He's only 24 years old. Part of me wants to think that he might naturally take a step back because nobody really expected him to perform like he did last year. But that said, he will likely have the same line mates who he had great chemistry with last year in Sean Monahan and Dmitry Voronkov. So there is realistic hope that Marchenko could continue to improve on his point total as he has every season of his career thus far. Sean Monahan had his fair share of injury problems throughout his career, but he put up his first point per game season last year since 2018, back when he was playing with the Young Guns in Calgary. If he can remain healthy, he is an excellent first-line center who plays a great defensive game, who's solid at the faceoff dot, and he's just a great leader to have in the locker room. A lot of guys love playing with him, and especially young guys like Adam Fantilli and Kent Johnson, who can definitely learn from Sean Monahan. And speaking of Johnson, he's another name that I haven't even mentioned, and he broke out last year as well. 24 goals, 57 points in 68 games. Just an insane amount of skill. He's had a pretty sweet hockey career thus far. Got drafted 5th overall, scored the gold medal clinching goal in one of the most electrifying overtimes in World Juniors history, and now he's progressing as a legit top 6 forward in the NHL. He's also good for at least like 3-4 highlight reel plays per season. And then there's the future face of this franchise, Adam Fantilli, who I mentioned led the team in goals with 31 goals at only 20 years of age. He actually started the season as a 19-year-old last year. He's an absolute stud on the ice, and he's just going to keep getting better and better. For whatever reason, him and Leo Carlson are going to be one of those draft class comparisons that I'm going to watch closely for the next 10 to 15 years because I really don't know who I would have taken. I don't know who I think is the better centerman. This early on, I'm leaning towards Fantilli, but they're both such amazing players that I'm curious to see how how their careers are going to go side by side because a lot of people thought Fantilli should have been drafted 2nd overall, but Anaheim chose to pass on him to take Leo Carlson. Like I said, 2 awesome players. Very curious to see how their careers compare in the next 10 to 15 years. Columbus's defense is where things get a little suspect. A lot of their guys on the back end can move the puck well. They can contribute offensively, obviously Werenski being the main guy here. But their defensive numbers were pretty bad last year. They finished 25th in goals against and 22nd at the penalty kill with only 77%. Even their advanced analytics show that they had a pretty tough time preventing high danger chances from the oppositions. And nothing really changed for this team's defense. So it's hard to believe that they're going to be able to put up, drastically different numbers. The biggest bright spot for this team's back end is another year of experience for Denton Matejchuk, who split time last year between the AHL and the NHL, but he has a lot of promise to become a top pairing guy in the NHL. He's only 21 years old. He's likely going to be a stable NHLer this season. So it'll be interesting to see who Dean Evison decides to pair the kid with. I'm sure they'll want to give him some big minutes, but it's also important not to expose him too much early on in his career. And then in nets, the Blue Jackets have steady, reliable Elvis Merzlikis, who's a pretty mid goaltender. He's rarely going to be a problem for the team, but also he isn't really there to steal many games for this team. Now, that said, will he even be the starter? Because last year, Jet Greaves had a very hot run to end the season. He actually finished the season with a 938 save percentage, which is unreal. But he only played 11 games, so obviously that number is, take it with a grain of salt. But he's got a long way to go before they give him the keys to the city. But I do think they're probably going to lead the way this season with Jet Greaves just because of, how well he played to end the season. The big questions for this team is whether or not their breakout players from last year can maintain the new expectations that they've set for themselves. Guys like Adam Fantilli and Kent Johnson, I have no doubt that they're going to improve, but can Werenski replicate his unreal season last year? And can Kirill Marchenko show the world that it wasn't just a flash in the pan season? That, along with clutch goaltending, will be the key for this team to make another playoff push. Having finished with 89 points last year, their over-under is currently set at 84.5, and I think they can get there this year. I'm going to take the over for the Columbus Blue Jackets. Next up on our list, at fourth in the Metropolitan Division, and likely taking one of two wildcard spots in the East, are the Washington Capitals. The team that finished first in the conference and led the way for pretty much the entire season last year. They finished with a record of 51, 22, and 9, and I don't think anyone would have predicted the Capitals to be the best team in the East during the regular season last year. Now, while fans were impressed by the team as a whole, nobody could steal the spotlight from Alex Ovechkin, who broke one of the league's unbreakable records. He surpassed Wayne Gretzky for the most goals in league history. This made headlines all over the sports world. I remember speaking to people who knew nothing about hockey, but they all knew that Ovechkin broke the record last year. I don't know if this had anything to do with the team performing so well. Maybe they didn't feel any pressure going to the season. Maybe all eyes were on Ovi. Whatever it was, the Washington Capitals had a great year overall. Ovi just turned 40 years old, by the way. That happened like 2 weeks ago. So happy birthday to him. Absolute legend. But what else went right for this team? Well, hats off to Spencer Carberry, first of all. He won the Jack Adams Trophy for best coach in the NHL after just his second year as head coach in the league. And he had this team clicking on all cylinders. Offensively, defensively, goaltending from both their guys. The Capitals were the second best in goals for, ninth best in goals against, fifth best penalty kill, and surprisingly, only the 14th best power play. But talking about breakout seasons from players in the Columbus Blue Jackets, the Washington Capitals had a number of breakout seasons themselves. Almost their entire roster had up years. Honestly, the only disappointment for me amongst the Washington Capitals roster was Andrew Mangiapane, who I thought was going to be a lot better for them last year. And don't worry, he wasn't on my list of top 10 signings. Thank God I didn't make that mistake. But they did get career highs from Dylan Strome, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Tom Wilson, Connor McMichael, Jacob Chikrin, who, by the way, was an amazing acquisition last summer, so much so that they extended him to an 8-year deal worth $9 million AAV right before the playoffs last year. A great deal for both sides. But we're not done talking about career highs. Rasmus Sandin, Nick Dowd, Brandon Duhaime. I could literally just go through their entire roster, and they almost all had career highs. But nobody had a bigger breakout season than Alexei Protas, who seemingly came out of nowhere to put up 30 goals and 66 points. His career high in goals was 6 goals in a full season, and then he got 30 last year. So while everything was all sunshine and rainbows last year for the Caps, That kind of makes them an easy target for regression this season. They do still have a great team, and they can definitely prove me wrong when I put them in a wildcard spot. I just don't necessarily think that they're the deepest team out there, and having them below the Rangers after the terrible season that the Rangers had last year might seem crazy, and very well might end up being crazy, but that's what predictions are for. I just don't see all those guys repeating the seasons they had last year. Not saying that they're all going to drop off, but it's unlikely that they all continue to play at the top of their game and, for everyone to stay healthy. Last year, they were a pretty healthy team. Now, I can't pull up the man games lost numbers because that includes TJ Oshie and Nicholas Backstrom, who are technically still a part of the team, but both missed the whole 82 games. So the numbers are a bit skewed. I mean, if I did math, I guess I could pull it out. But I could surely tell you that they weren't a very injured team, and that is something that you can't really expect year after year. So looking at the roster, which actually, shit, I haven't even talked about their offseason moves yet. Okay, let's do that first. The players that left Washington over the summer are Andrew Mangiapane, who went and signed in Edmonton, Taylor Radish, who signed with the Rangers, and Lars Eller, who's now in Ottawa. So nothing too significant from aside from some depth pieces. They added Declan Chisholm in a trade with Minnesota. I honestly do not know much about this guy, but they signed him to a 2-year deal, and I assume he's just going to be some added depth on that blue line. Now, Daily Faceoff has newly acquired Justin Sourdif on their fourth line wing. The Capitals signed him over the offseason to a 2-year minimum deal, but he only has 4 NHL games under his belt. So, I mean, I wouldn't be so sure that he's going to make the lineup over more experienced depth guys like Sonny Milano or even one of their own former first round picks in Hendrix Lapierre. Nonetheless, another guy that adds depth to this roster. Aside from those two names, Washington spent most of their time and energy locking up players that they already had in their squad. Martin Ferveri signed a 7-year deal worth $6 million a year, and Anthony Beauvillier signed a 2-year deal worth $2.75. Now, looking at the roster, there's 2 young guys that are likely to make their debut as full-time NHLers this year. That is Ryan Leonard and Ivan Miroshnikov. Jesus Christ. Let's try that again. Ivan Miroshnichenko. Clearly, you can tell I haven't seen this kid much. He was drafted in the first round by the Caps in 2022. He's already got 39 NHL games with the Caps, including 1 playoff game. That wasn't this year, though. That was the prior year. But he spent most of the last 2 seasons down in the AHL. It looks like there's, a good chance for this kid to make the jump. But Ryan Leonard is the big one, in my opinion. He's an easy top 5 pick for the Calder Trophy this season. We saw glimpses of what he can do. He joined the Caps late last season, right after his season with Boston College ended, and he suited up for 8 of 10 playoff games for the Capitals. He's a mini Tom Wilson, a guy that hits hard, hounds pucks in the corner. He earned himself a top 10 draft pick by just being an all-around force on the ice. A kid that has a bit of everything. And he was the best forward for Team USA at the World Juniors last year when they won the gold medal, and he even took home the honors of best forward of the tournament. So I definitely think he's going to be a big impact player for this team. But to my earlier point, I'm not sure I trust this team's top 6 to be as dominant as they were last year. Their defense, without question, is solid. Maybe one of the best third pairings in the league, if that's where you put Sandin and Matt Roy. Again, I'm just looking at their lineups here on Daily Faceoff. That said, these 2 guys were the 3rd and 4th most used players on the team in terms of minutes, so maybe not quite third pairing. But either way, Ferraveri as their 5th most used D-man, and that's definitely not a bad thing. So their D is solid. That's not where the problem is. The top 6. A 40-year-old Alex Ovechkin, who's just bound to regress eventually. My guess is probably this year. Dylan Strome. Now, he's a guy that I wouldn't be shocked if he does what he did last season. Pierre-Luc Dubois, a problem player. He's always been a problem player who finally put aside all that noise last year, but I can't say I'm very confident that he's going to do it again this year. Tom Wilson, Protas, and whoever the 6th guy is, either an unproven Ryan Leonard. Daily Faceoff has Anthony Beauvillier on the top line, actually. Not sure I agree with that. But anyway, it's just not the scariest top 6 in the league. And then the depth forwards, the bottom 6, doesn't necessarily turn heads either. So a team that I mentioned was an offensive force last year just doesn't scare me as much as other teams. Taking 20 goals away from Ovechkin's total last year, which I think is reasonable, makes this offense very different. Anyway, that is my only knock on this team and why I don't think they're going to be as dominant as they were last year. But before we move on, I do need to shout out their goaltenders, Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren, who are probably the one of the best tandems in the NHL last year. Charlie Lindgren didn't necessarily have the best year last year, but the year before he was spectacular. Specifically, Logan Thompson, though, another guy who took being left off of Team Canada personal. He came back a different beast in the second half of the season. Naturally, the Caps locked him up for a 6-year deal at a huge steal of 5.85 mil. So they're set between the pipes for years to come. Anyway, let's move on from the Washington Capitals. Real quick, their over-under is 96.5, and that's already a big drop-off from their 111-point finish last year. But I still think I'm going to take the under. That might sound crazy, but I see them finishing around, 94, 95 points. Who knows? I might be completely off. Let's move on to our top 3 spots in the Metropolitan Division, a playoff team. Finishing third, I have the New Jersey Devils. They finished third in the division last year as well, with a record of 42, 33, and 7, but had 2 very different seasons. Before Jacob Markstrom got hurt and after. The Devils looked amazing in the first half of the season. On January 17th, just a few days before Markstrom got hurt, the Devils were only 3 points back from second place in the Eastern Conference and third place in the National Hockey League. They were boasting great defensive numbers, again, thanks to a healthy Jacob Markstrom and the system implemented by new bench boss Sheldon Keefe. But once Markstrom went down with that knee injury, things started to turn around a bit for this team. And then March comes along, and the New Jersey Devils lose their best player, Jack Hughes, to a brutal shoulder injury that took him out for the rest of the season and playoffs. Even though they were a lock for the playoffs at that point, I think all hope was lost in New Jersey. Without Hughes, the Devils were the 9th worst team in the NHL, getting only 19 points in their last 20 games. I will say, even after Hughes went down, Jesper Bratt continued to impress the hell out of me and a lot of other hockey fans. I'm always amazed when a player goes unnoticed by scouts and becomes a superstar in the best league on the planet. It's baffling sometimes. I've talked about this many times before. I mean, I'm not a scout and I don't watch junior players that closely, but the plays that Bratt makes, the vision he has, the way he uses his body, the creativity, it's incredible. And I don't understand how people didn't see that in his game before the NHL. And same goes for guys like Kucherov, Panarin, Kaprizov. Ironically, I just mentioned 3 Russians, but they're all guys who were not highly touted at their draft. Kucherov was the highest, being picked in the second round. But Panarin, undrafted, Kaprizov, I believe, a 4th-round pick. All these guys are now legit some of the best hockey players on the planet. So it's just crazy how that works. Going back to Bratt, though, I think he was a 6th-round pick, and he is now just an absolute superstar. But anyway, the Devils didn't have the best end to the season. I'm sure they're not pleased with how things went. And then over the offseason, they saw a number of decent roster players leave. Eric Hollow went to Nashville. Thomas Tatar, I think, recently signed in Switzerland, so his NHL days might be finished. Brian Dumoulin went to LA. Curtis Lazar in Edmonton. Justin Dowling in New York, and then Nathan Bastian went to Dallas. To replace these guys, they brought in Arseny Gritsuk, a 5th-round pick that they drafted, who had a great season in the KHL last year, and they decided to sign him to an NHL deal. They also signed Connor Brown to a 4-year deal worth $3 million annually, and then 2 PTOs in Kevin Rooney and Luke Glendening. They were another team that focused their summer on re-signing players that contributed to the early success they had last year. Evgeny Dadonov. I thought he was going to be walking in free agency, but they locked him up late to another 1-year deal. Jake Allen, backup goalie, signed a 5-year deal worth 1.8 annually. That is an amazing deal for a guy like Jake Allen. Cody Glass, another player who was extended 2 years, worth 2.5. And then, best of all, a guy that some thought might miss some time due to contract negotiations. I just mentioned him early on in the episode, but last night, or yesterday afternoon, I should say, Luke Hughes signed a 7 times $9 million contract, making him the highest paid player on the team, along with Dougie Hamilton. This team's decor is locked up for at least another 2 seasons. Brendan Dillon has the soonest expiry date on that blue line, and that's a good thing. Like I mentioned, they had an elite defensive year last year, And the 6 guys in the roster who are all locked up don't even include Seamus Casey and Simon Nemec. 2 guys that have very bright futures and will likely get some NHL time this year. Apparently, Seamus Casey has been the better player thus far at camp, and with Jonathan Kovacevic likely to be sidelined early in the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Casey started the season with the Devils. Now, Daily Faceoff has Simon Nemec in the lineup instead, but we'll see what happens. 2 guys that are going to be competing for a spot, 2 great young defensemen, a good problem for New Jersey to have. The positives for the Devils last year, aside from their defense, which we already talked about, was their top end scoring. Their top 6 were all on the same page for the majority of the season. So much so that they finished the season 13th in scoring, despite having the 3rd worst goals per game in the second half. I guess I made that more confusing than it had to be. By January 1st, the Devils had the 4th most goals in the league. And then from January 1st on, they were second last, ahead of only San Jose. We talked about Hughes and Bratt, but it doesn't end there. There's that Swiss connection they have on the second line with Nico Hischier and Timo Meier. Most people know Hischier is a great defensive forward, which he is. He's also amazing at the faceoff dot, by the way. 54.6% is quite good. But he's also turned himself into a steady 30-goal scorer year after year. And then there's Timo Meier, who is a heavy power forward who he himself is good for at least like 25 goals a season. But unfortunately for the Devils, their offensive depth is not great. Stefan Noesen put up career numbers last year, but he, just like the rest of the team, had a pretty bad second half. In fact, only a quarter of his goal total came in the second half. Andre Palat isn't nearly what he used to be. Although he can still be a key contributor in big games, he's always been a decent playoff player. He's sadly become one of the worst contracts on the team. Now, I really like their 3C. Dawson Mercer, I think, is a solid young player, but his numbers were also a bit underwhelming last year. Now, that said, Tom Fitzgerald, the GM of the team, went out and acquired some speed to play with him on that third line, to play with Dawson Mercer. And that could be this KHL kid Gritsuk, or even Connor Brown, or Paul Cotter, who I think can be better than his numbers show. So Keefe is going to have to work with his guys to really get more production from his bottom 6. But I do see some improvement, especially Dawson Mercer. I said I like his game a lot. I think he's going to turn into a solid player and a good 3C for this team. Their defense are the same dogs that we saw last year. Now, it's unfortunate that Dougie Hamilton can't seem to string together a fully healthy season, but when he's in the lineup and when he's on his game, there aren't many better D-men on both sides of the ice than this guy. Now, looking at the daily faceoff lines, although I don't always agree with them, they have Dougie Hamilton and Brandon Dillon on the first pairing, which is solid. These 2 guys played together for a combined 733 minutes last year. So very fair to assume that they're going to be paired up again this year. Behind them, you have Luke Hughes, Brett Pesce. That's a good second pairing. Pesce being a perfect stay-at-home guy to back up the elite skating Luke Hughes. Pesci's definitely a guy that should be labeled underrated. Not a lot of people talk about him because he's not flashy at all. Doesn't get a lot of love, but he's a warrior. In the playoffs, he blocked 18 shots in 5 games. So, a solid guy that does, he can be trusted by his coach in almost any situation. Not the most offensive guy, but being paired with Luke Hughes, I think that's a great pairing for that second line. And then you have Jonas Siegenthaler, who helped his partner, Jonathan Kovacevic, go from a waiver pickup just a few years ago to earning a $4 million cap hit contract. Now, I'm not taking away credit from Kovacevic. He had a great year, but I also think he had a very good pairing on that third line with Jonas Siegenthaler. And then, like I said, even better considering that you have Seamus Casey and Simon Nemec right there to jump in case one of these guys go down with an injury. And then Markstrom is yet another guy to add to this team's list of injury-prone players. It really sucks, and it's something you got to deal with, but if things bounce their way and they can stay healthy, we've seen that Markstrom could be a top goalie in the league. And same goes for the rest of this team. We've seen the New Jersey Devils play the way they can, and they're a scary force out there. But if for whatever reason Markstrom goes down again, I talked about that Jake Allen contract. Him making only $1.8 million a year as a backup that helped cool the hot head of Jordan Binnington when the Blues won the Cup in 2019. I think he's a great guy to have as a backup. Obviously, if Markstrom goes down, that's a huge loss for this team, but it's very good to know that you have a guy like Jake Allen who can back him up. Now, the keys for this team are obvious. Health, like I mentioned, especially in those three main guys, Jack Hughes, Dougie Hamilton, and Markstrom. But if they're all healthy and everything goes well, I think they can very, very well even win the division. Their over-under is set at 99.5, and that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. If I were to place a bet, I would probably bet the under just because of injuries. I mean, it's like I said, it's very rare for a team to go a whole season without injuries. And considering some of these guys are more prone, betting the under is a safe bet. However, if for somehow you can guarantee me that they're going to stay healthy, then I would smash the over. So, I mean, take that as you will. I'm not really giving you an answer there. Let's move on. Second place in the Metro Division, the New York Rangers. They are my team for the biggest bounce back season, at least in the East. I think I'd give that label to Vancouver in the West. But definitely, I think the Rangers are going to be better this year than they were last year, and they might even make a big playoff push. I mean, I have them finishing at second in the division, so they better make a playoff push. They finished last year with a record of 39, 36, and 7. And it's crazy to think how bad this team dropped off last year. They were coming off a President's Trophy win the season prior and an Eastern Conference Finals appearance and a 120-point season from Artemi Panarin. And then last year, things actually started off pretty well too. They started the season 12-4-1, and then randomly things just started to crumble. It must have been during that Western Conference road trip. This team came out looking completely different, and that made GM Chris Drury start picking up the phone and start shopping his players. They traded their captain, Jacob Trouba, to the Anaheim Ducks. And then 2 weeks later, they traded their former second overall pick, Capo Caco, to the Seattle Kraken. Then later in January, they traded Philip Hedl to Vancouver, but in return, they got back a former player and their newly appointed captain, JT Miller. Then at the deadline, the Rangers continued selling by trading Ryan Lindgren and Riley Smith. And then this past summer, they traded longtime Ranger Chris Kreider and young D-man Keandre Miller. So by the sounds of it, it seems like they are taking apart their team for a rebuild. But something gives me an inkling that this team isn't going anywhere. I have a feeling they're not going for that rebuild and they are going to bounce back this year. They're going to be a completely new team this year, obviously, because I just named a bunch of guys that are gone. But they also hired a new coach, Mike Sullivan. And a couple more names that they actually did not bring back over the summer, Zach Jones, Calvin DeHaan, and Arthur Kaliev. But the Rangers did make one of the biggest splashes of free agency by signing D-man Vladislav Gavrikov to a 7x7 contract. A pretty damn good deal for a top pairing D-man still in his prime. I'm going to go back to that Provorov contract one more time to rip it apart. I think Gavrikov's a way better D-man than Provorov, and he signed for less. The Rangers also signed Taylor Radish, and then they re-signed Matt Rempe and Will Cooley. So this team is far from what they were when they won the President's Trophy, but I think they're going to surprise people this year. And for pretty much the complete opposite reason I mentioned when talking about the Capitals. The Capitals had career highs from nearly everyone. I don't necessarily think that's sustainable. The Rangers, on the other hand, had widespread disappointment, and I don't think that's sustainable either. I think it's fair to assume guys like Panarin, Zibanejad, Lafreniere, Trocheck, they're all going to bounce back to some degree. And then you bring in the grit and the skill and the intensity of JT Miller to this team. That's a pretty good top six I just named right there. Zibanejad in particular was a shell of his usual self, especially offensively. He's never been a very reliable guy on the defensive side of things, but he's usually an elite offensive producer, and we just didn't see that last year. So I'm sure he's going to be looking to bounce back hard this year. Will Cooley showed that he can be a legit power forward. He broke out with 20 goals, and he contributed in ways that don't necessarily show up on the score sheet. Their goaltending doesn't need much explaining. They have Igor Shesterkin, a guy who's shown many times that he could be the best goalie on the planet. Not just one season, but he's done it many, many times. He's even a Vezina Trophy winner. And he's backed by future Hall of Famer Jonathan Quick, who's still got a ton of game left in him. Now, the defense is where things get alarming for this team. Let's start off with the positives, and that is that top pairing. Now, I will say, I am one of the few people to claim that I think Adam Fox is overrated. By no means am I saying he's a bad player. He's an amazing player. But to hear so many people have him as like a top 3 or a top 5 D-man in the league, I don't think he's shown enough to be there. Sure, he's won a Norris Trophy, but that was 5 years ago. Honestly, I already thought this before the Four Nations last year, but that tournament really solidified my opinion. He was one of the least used D-men on Team USA, and for good reason, because he wasn't great. Now, don't get this twisted. I'm not saying that Adam Fox is a bad D-man. Not at all. In fact, he is a top pairing guy on pretty much any team in the National Hockey League. And now they brought in Gavrikov to play with him. Assuming they're going to be paired together, I think this year is the year for Adam Fox to prove me wrong. These two guys are going to log massive minutes for the Rangers, and it's pretty much out of necessity because this team has a huge drop off after them. The Rangers moved on from both Trouba and Keandre Miller, leaving their third best D-man as either Carson Soucy or Will Borgen. That's probably going to be their second pairing, and it isn't great. Now, that said, their third pairing is a young and kind of a wild card group. Two big mobile D-men in Urho Vakanainen and Braden Schneider. And when a team brings in a new coach, especially one as well known as Mike Sullivan, you never know how young players are going to perform. Could be vastly different than what we saw last year under Laviolette. The big question for this team is going to be what Drury's plan is. If they are using this retool as a quick fix and they're looking to be right back in the mix with a good start and maybe some roster tweaks later on, I'm confident that this team can be a playoff team. However, if they are looking ahead to the stacked draft class in 2026 and they end up selling more guys throughout the season, well, then obviously I'm going to be wrong with this prediction. But keep in mind, it's also Panarin's last year on his contract. So whether he's going to look to move on or not, he's going to probably want to perform pretty damn well if he wants another big paycheck. But on the other hand of that, if I were Drury, honestly, I would probably commit to a few more years of misery because you can sell Panarin for a massive return, maybe sell off some other pieces as well, draft very high in a very good draft class, and then go from there. But if he chooses otherwise, if he wants to compete, I think Drury has a lot of nice toys to work with here. So let's move on. The over-under for the Rangers is set at 95.5, and that's a big 10-point jump from their last year finish. And I'm going to be bold. I'm going to take the over on this one. I mean, I have to. I just put them at second in the division. Second behind only the Carolina Hurricanes, a team that loves regular season hockey. They've been near the top of this division for too damn long. In fact, they've finished either first or second in this division every year since 2020, the COVID shortened season. And things shouldn't be any different this year. They were a great team last year, and I think they replaced every hole that left, and more. Over the offseason, they lost Dmitry Orlov to the San Jose Sharks, Brent Burns, signed in Colorado, Jack Roslovic, who's still a UFA, by the way. I don't know why. I probably have him as the number one UFA still on the market. Scott Morrow, Riley Stillman, Spencer Martin, Jesper Fast, who retired, by the way, and Dustin Tokarski, another UFA goaltender. But as I mentioned, they filled all these missing pieces with bigger name guys. They brought in Caden Primo, who's going to be probably an AHL goalie, Mike Riley, who's a decent third pairing D-man, but then they got their stud two-way D-man, Keandre Miller. Now, some might think I'm using the word stud a little too loosely, but I think he's going to be even more of a stud than he already was now playing under Rod Brind'Amour on one of the best defensive teams in the league. And then the Hurricanes landed the biggest offensive free agent not named Mitch Marner, and that is Nikolai Ehlers, who left his longtime home of Winnipeg to join this Hurricanes team. The Canes have had some wild turnover at the deadline in recent years. 2 years ago, they acquired Jake Getzel, who was the biggest name at the deadline that year. Things didn't work out so well, and they lost him in free agency to the Tampa Bay Lightning. Last year, they went out and acquired the other biggest name that was being shopped around that, I want to say trade deadline, but it wasn't quite the trade deadline. They acquired Mikko Rantanen, a trade that shocked the entire hockey world. But things weren't looking very smooth. He didn't seem to be a great fit in Carolina. And then Tulski made the quick decision to flip him before repeating their mistake with Getzel and losing him for nothing in the offseason. Only weeks after they acquired Rantanen from Colorado, the Canes traded him to the Dallas Stars for young, up-and-coming star Logan Stankoven, who they then locked up for 8 years this past summer, paying him $6 million a year. So he's going to be a great piece to add to this already young and elite team. They ultimately lost a winger in Gensel. Then they traded Natchez, another winger, to get Rantanen, and then they lost Rantanen altogether. So they kind of came out with a pretty big piece on that wing, which they now filled again this summer with Ehlers. So if you look at the grand scope of things from last year to this year, talking about that forward area, they lost Natchez and Jack Drury. They acquired Stankoven, a bunch of first round picks, and now got Nikolai Ehlers. I think they're looking even better than they were last year. Now, the Carolina Hurricanes always dominate at 5-on-5. They have an extremely aggressive forechecking system, and with Ehlers' speed and Keandre Miller's contribution offensively, I think they're going to remain one of the hardest teams to play against. The Canes led the NHL in shot attempts, scoring chances, and high danger chances at 5-on-5 last season. But with all that, they only finished ninth in scoring. So while that obviously isn't bad, that kind of shows one of the few problems they had, which was finishing on their scoring chances. They haven't had a 40-goal guy since Eric Stahl, and while I don't think Ehlers is going to be that guy, he's definitely going to add to the scoring in his own way, and the team will collectively look to improve on their goal total. Now, on the other hand, when talking about Ehlers, for whatever reason, he was averaging less than 16 minutes a game for the past 3 seasons in Winnipeg, which is not something you should see from a top 6 forward, let alone a first line player, which he definitely can be. So, even increasing that by 2 minutes, let's say he averages 18 minutes a game, I think that can easily bring his season average goal total of 27 to up and above 30 goals. Now, we obviously have to mention the other guys on this Carolina Hurricanes team, led by superstar center Sebastian Aho. He's another guy that has a little bit of everything. He's not the biggest body, but he's a very smart player who can shoot and pass and skate and defend well. They also have youngsters Seth Jarvis, Jackson Blake, and now Logan Stankoven. They're also going to be very key contributors to this team's offense. And then we can't forget their most lethal shooter in Andrei Svechnikov. So this offense has so many weapons. I didn't even mention former Hart Trophy winner Taylor Hall. He's obviously not what he used to be, and he has big trouble staying healthy, but a great veteran guy who can pot an easy 20 if he plays a full 82 games. Big if there, but still. And then there's a guy that we haven't seen nearly enough considering all the hype surrounding him, and that is 23-year-old defenseman Alexander Nikishin, who joined the team straight from the KHL last year for the end of their second round playoff matchup against the Capitals. I've heard so much about this guy. I've even heard some people say that he's a future Norris player, which is wild. I mean, probably a little over the top, as a lot of hockey fans and writers are, but still not a guy to disregard. So, talking about him, let's look at the rest of this team's defense. Probably one of the best defense in the league, led by the best defensive D-man in the NHL, and that really showed at the Four Nations last year. Jacob Slavin is he's the reason why there should be a separate defenseman award for best defensive defenseman, because him never getting considered for the Norris is just criminal. Let's say he plays alongside Keandre Miller, who's very familiar with playing top pairing role, but he's probably going to have a better suited partner. Keandre Miller played a lot of the games with Adam Fox. Not slamming Adam Fox, a hell of a defenseman, but Slavin is a perfect partner, a guy who could cover for whatever mistakes come with Keandre Miller's offensive game. Not only is Slavin going to be able to help him improve his defensive side, but they're really just going to gel together. It just makes sense. Their two styles go very well together, and that's a very solid top pairing defense. And then behind them, you have, I mean, you can make up any pairing you want from guys like Nikishin, Shane Gostisbehere, Jalen Chatfield, Sean Walker. These are all guys who can easily play in the top 4 and eat up, 18 to 19 minutes a game, but they won't always have to for this team. Regardless of what pairing the opposition matches up against, they're not going to have an easy time controlling the puck in the offensive zone. This team, as you can tell, has very few holes, and if I am going to pinpoint one, it would have to be the goaltending. Now, Freddie Anderson actually has pretty astonishing numbers when he's healthy, but he is never healthy. I can't remember the last time he's played a full season. In fact, let me pull it up real quick. Okay, the last time he played over 50 games was 2021, 2022. Maybe not that long ago. To be honest, I thought it was longer. But 3 full seasons of injury-riddled campaigns is not a good look, which is, again, very unfortunate because he's a solid goalie when he's in the net. And Peter Kochetkov isn't a bad backup either, but the uncertainty of whether or not Anderson's going to be fully healthy when he's suiting up is just not something that would sit comfortably for this fan base. But aside from that, I really don't have many negatives to point out for this Carolina Hurricanes team. They're a hell of a team, and they just need to find a way to get over the hump in the playoffs, that hump being the Florida Panthers. Now, I'll say it again, it's absolutely devastating what happened to Barkov, detrimental even. But I hope he can somehow recover fully for the playoffs, and we can see if this Hurricanes team can finally, or any team for that matter, can finally take down the reigning champs. But if any team can do it out of the East, or at least out of the Metro, I'd say it's the Carolina Hurricanes. So to conclude, the over-under on the Hurricanes is set at 106.5, and that is another hard one. It's almost like they're setting these numbers to be hard on purpose. Good one, Puck Drop. I'm going to take the over on this one because I think they're the best regular season team in the Eastern Conference, maybe even in the league. Wouldn't be surprised if they win the President's Trophy this year. So that does it for the Metro Division preview. Thank you all for sticking with me through all of this. We almost got under an hour. We didn't, unfortunately, but at least it's not 2 hours. We're going to be back with 2 more divisional breakdowns before the official regular season puck drop on October 8th. Until then, stay safe and have a great week, everyone.
See through your glass ceiling, only reflections from the light